we're getting dire warnings that if we don't vote for this bill, we're contemplating shutdown. We don't actually know if that's the case, but we do know a few things that are facts. I think this bill is an historic bill. I think it's an historic step backwards on what we've been able to build in Minnesota over the course of many generations now. Through very, very difficult political circumstances, many trials in this body and others, hard-fought gains to build a legacy that we could all be proud of, to leave an environment for our generations to come to enjoy. Preserved, clean, safe, productive, not used up, that upholds our quality of life, our values, and our health. And I believe strongly that this moves us backwards, contrary to a legacy, in a violation of a legacy that's been left to us. I'll read a passage that was in the newspaper recently. Legislators are brazenly putting the needs of special interests over Minnesota's treasured natural resources with an agriculture and environment budget bill that undercuts critical pollution safeguards. In doing so, they also set an alarming warning to anyone in years to come who challenge powerful interests. Those who ask hard questions should expect political payback. In future elections, voters should ask, how did incumbents vote on a bill that so clearly prioritized special interests over Minnesota's natural resources? Those are strong words. We inherit the legacy of Willard Munger and so many others who passed before us. I understand the nature of omnibus bills. And Senator Weber is correct. Sometimes policy does find its way into these budget bills. And sometimes there's a couple of stinkers. I voted for a few, and I've had to go back to my district and explain, in the interest of moving forward, in the interest of finding some reasonable compromise. There's give and take. There's trade-offs. At last count, Madam President and members, there are at least 13 measures that put us significantly backwards in unwinding the hard work and the policies, the allocation of resources that we've been able to achieve over many years. The Citizens Board. The PCA is not the only entity that has a Citizens Board. We install Citizens Boards for a lot of good reasons in a lot of places. Housing Finance Agency, Met Council. We've heard many, many speeches in this chamber. We've been excoriated by certain newspaper columnists that we can't violate $1 that's been allocated and designated by one of our legacy Citizens Boards. LCCMR is another one. We were told yesterday that process is good. When you get stuff in that you like, process is bad. When stuff gets into a bill that you don't like. Well, I'll venture that Citizens Boards are good when you agree with them, and they're your citizens that are upholding the things you want, and perhaps Citizens Boards are bad when you disagree, and we should just simply abolish them. But we have a long tradition. We have literally dozens upon dozens of Citizens Boards who do hard work and help us craft policy and allocate resources, and we try our hardest to uphold and honor that work for very, very good reasons. And this particular Citizens Board has done outstanding work, and this is clearly in reaction to one decision that they made by a very, very powerful interest. I don't understand how it is that we broke a compromise on what was a good idea, the biofuels initiative. And all the stakeholders came together and came up with an outstanding compromise so that we could certainly use the corn product, but we could also do cover crops and maybe improve our ability to preserve our land resources, to preserve our water resources, to also spark the next generation of cellulosic biofuels. And that was hard and excellent work Senator Saxog shepherded. And everyone was pleased. And then we just, I guess, saw it upon ourselves to simply break that great coming together of a diverse set of stakeholders. I think we've all come to understand that sulfide mining is most likely going to happen in Minnesota. But we've said, and everyone seems to always say, we want sulfide mining to be as safe as possible. We know for a fact that sulfide mining in other places in this country and other countries has had devastating consequences on their water. Devastating. With sulfuric acid leaching out of the tailings into the water, the groundwater, and the surface water. We know that the waters of northern Minnesota are extremely sensitive to their pH. They're cold lakes, very, very sensitive to interruption. So why prematurely grant this exemption before we even know if it's needed or not? And environmental review is not permitting. It's a different matter altogether that precedes permitting. Permitting that's informed by rules. Suspending wild rice, protections for wild rice to some point in the distant future. Meanwhile, the wild rice just can sit there. Tying state agencies' hands on environmental review so that companies' permitting process are not enforced with prior warning.
Senator Nelson, for what purpose does the gentlewoman rise?
Madam President, point of order. Senate
point.
Rule 36, debate. Members shall speak only to the question under debate and avoid personality. And it also reminds me of Mason's 142. We are not to impugn motives. The speaker has said that hard questions are political payback. That is impugning motives. And Madam President and members, our job is to ask the hard questions, and to assume that those are political payback is impugning motives and personality, and it is against our Senate rules and our traditions.
Senator Dibble.
Madam President, I apologize if I violated the rules.
Okay, why don't you, thank you, Senator Nelson. Why don't you continue, Senator Dibble?
Madam President, Senator Marty brought up this subject. It bears repeating. How on earth are we going to be able to go back to our own districts and tell our constituents that it is quite possible that they're going to go to their local nursery and buy a bunch of lovely plants for the purpose of attracting bees and butterflies and other sorts of pollinators, plants that very possibly have been cultivated with systemic pesticides so that within their very branches and leaves and flowers, they have pesticides that have sublethal effects on pollinators. They're putting together butterfly gardens and bee gardens and those sorts of things with plants that are labeled pollinator friendly that themselves harm pollinators. We know from the amazing research that's being done at the University of Minnesota, research that we've funded with new labs and new research dollars and that sort of thing, nation-setting research, that this issue of the declining pollinators, myriad wild pollinators, the domestic bee population, our butterflies, is complicated and multifaceted. And it's not that necessarily these neonicotinoids kill bees on contact. Sometimes there's a sublethal effect, and they make bees, basically they make bees sick and make them less capable of foraging, less capable of operating as a community in a hive, and hence we have this tremendous amount of hive collapse as one aspect of many. We know that, and so we're going to be asking people. We saw the White House initiative a few days ago, wanting to put a million gardens out there that help uphold and support pollinators throughout the country. And we're going to potentially be selling folks plants that are pollinator friendly that are exactly the opposite because of a provision in this. Exempting cities from the Metro Water Supply, restructuring our Metropolitan Area Water Supply Planning Advisory Committee, undoing cost analyses that have already been done by the PCA. On the one hand, we eliminate the Citizens Board because the PCA is doing fine work and is fully adequate, and we cite the approval of the PCA, and so we don't need a set of independent eyes to review their work. And then we hear speeches about how, they're just arbitrary, capricious, not basing their decisions on science. They're just kind of taking their best guess because they're a bunch of tree huggers. There's no sense in the various speeches that we're hearing. So we're making them go back and unwind all of their work. I'm happy that the Metropolitan Landfill Contingency Action Trust is going to have a repay for the dollars that are diverted. I'm not quite sure why we're diverting those dollars in times of surplus. That's fantastic. But we've been rating that fund to the tune of over $43 million. This is, of course, to close our landfills and make sure that in the future they don't have ongoing tremendous environmental consequence for the areas in which they sit. And then this polluter amnesty provision, Madam President. So if folks, quote, self-report, suddenly the PCA is stripped of all of its powers and enforcement authority. And finally, I just have to say on this so-called nuisance study, it's going right to an agenda that's been we've seen in state after state after state of trying to eliminate the ability of citizens and businesses and frankly agricultural interests themselves to deal with operations and consequences that have terrible negative consequences on their ability to live where they live, to conduct their businesses, to have any semblance of quality of life because of the gross violations of particular operations around them. These are not frivolous lawsuits. When a lawsuit is brought against a nuisance that's nearby, it's for a significant reason of significant harm and consequence that's occurring to those around. We just saw the issue of the stranded electricity after a farming operation. If we go and start inhibiting people's ability to take steps to protect themselves, would that lawsuit have been allowed to proceed? So, Madam President, I appreciate that we're in a difficult circumstance. I believe absolutely that we should not be asked to step forward and violate our core principles, our values, the things we're elected to uphold, the things we communicated to our voters that we would stand for and fight for over 13 times over in one bill. Thank you, Madam President.